For 24 hours after the USS Thresher imploded, something was banging from inside the wreckage, 37 metallic knocks that no one can explain. The USS Thresher, America's deadliest submarine disaster, took 129 men to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean on April 10, 1963. For over 60 years, the Navy told us everyone died instantly when the submarine imploded at crush depth. Case closed. Nothing to see here. But then classified documents surfaced, and what they revealed about those final hours will haunt you. Because while rescue ships circled helplessly on the surface, acoustic monitoring stations were picking up something impossible. Deliberate, rhythmic banging coming from 8,400 feet below. Signals that lasted minutes at a time. Patterns that matched Navy emergency protocols. Someone or something was trying to communicate from the depths of the Atlantic. And that's just the beginning of what investigators found when they finally reached the wreckage. Personal artifacts floating in the darkness. A single piece of evidence that proved the Navy had been lying about the cause. And acoustic data suggesting some of the crew survived the initial disaster and knew exactly what was coming. This isn't just another submarine story. This is about the artifacts of human desperation, scattered across 33 acres of ocean floor, telling a tale of preventable tragedy and covered-up negligence. About rubber gloves that shouldn't have survived, metallic fragments that revealed criminal shortcuts, and mysterious signals that challenge everything we thought we knew about how the Thresher died. So buckle up, because we're diving into the deepest, darkest secrets the Atlantic Ocean has ever kept. When the USS Thresher vanished on April 10, 1963, everyone assumed all 129 souls died instantly in the implosion. The official Navy report was crystal clear. Catastrophic flooding, immediate loss of buoyancy, rapid descent to crush depth, and instant death for everyone aboard. Clean, simple, tragic. But declassified acoustic data reveals something far more disturbing. You see, the U.S. Navy had something called SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System, a network of underwater microphones designed to track Soviet submarines during the Cold War. These sensitive instruments could pick up the sound of a whale breathing from hundreds of miles away. And on April 10, 1963, they were listening when the Thresher died. What they recorded should have been impossible. For over 24 hours after the submarine's last transmission, experiencing minor difficulty attempting to blow, SOSUS monitoring stations detected 37 instances of metallic knocking, rhythmic banging, and high-frequency pings coming from 8,400 feet below the surface. Let me say that again. For 24 hours after the Thresher supposedly imploded and killed everyone instantly, something was making deliberate noises from the wreckage. The first signals came just minutes after the final radio transmission. Sharp, metallic impacts against steel, then rhythmic patterns. Some lasted 3 minutes at a time. Others came in short, urgent bursts. The acoustic signature was consistent with metal tools striking the submarine's hull from the inside. But, according to the Navy's official story, there was no inside. The submarine had imploded. Everyone was dead. These sounds were impossible. Navy officials quickly dismissed the signals as collapsing debris or acoustic echoes. Just the natural sounds of twisted metal settling on the ocean floor. Nothing more, except the patterns were too organized, too deliberate, too much like the emergency signaling protocols that every submarine crew was trained to use. You know what's really crazy? The USS Seawolf, a submarine participating in the search effort, also picked up these signals. Their sonar operators reported metallic knocking sounds that seemed to come in response to their own sonar pings, like someone was trying to answer back. The Seawolf's captain filed a report about these acoustic anomalies. That report was immediately classified and buried for 60 years. Think about that for a second. While rescue ships circled helplessly above, while families waited desperately for news, while the whole world mourned the loss of 129 brave men, The Navy knew something was still alive down there. And they kept quiet about it. Why would they do that? What were they trying to hide? The truth is, if the Navy had admitted that crew members survived the initial disaster, it would have raised uncomfortable questions. Questions about response time. Questions about rescue capabilities. Questions about whether those men could have been saved. Better to stick with the clean story. Instant death. No survivors. No one left behind. But acoustic data doesn't lie. And those 37 instances of metallic signaling tell a different story entirely. Some experts believe the sounds were crew members using tools to bang on the hull, trying to signal rescue ships above. Others think they might have been attempting to send sonar pings using whatever equipment was still functioning. The most haunting theory? That trapped crew members were using the submarine's emergency protocols, tapping out coded messages that no one was listening for. The signals weren't random. They came in patterns. Short bursts followed by longer pauses. Groups of 3 knocks, then silence, then more groups. If you know anything about maritime distress signals, those patterns are eerily familiar. And here's the part that makes my blood run cold. Some of those signals lasted until the next morning. More than 16 hours after the Thresher was supposed to have imploded and killed everyone instantly. The Navy's own acoustic experts noted unusual metallic impacts and organized sound patterns in their classified analysis. But publicly, they stuck to the story of immediate catastrophic failure and instant death. It wasn't until 2020, when Freedom of Information Act lawsuits forced the Navy to release thousands of pages of previously classified documents, that the truth about these acoustic signals finally came to light. And even then, it was buried in technical jargon and acoustic analysis that most people wouldn't understand. But those 37 signals represent something profound. They're not just acoustic data. They're the last desperate attempts of American sailors to communicate with the world above. They're evidence that the clean, simple story we've been told about the Thresher disaster is fundamentally wrong. And if the Navy lied about those signals, what else were they covering up? Because when Robert Ballard descended to the debris field in 1985, his cameras revealed a scene that looked like a giant had put a submarine through a shredder. Picture this: 33 acres of ocean floor at 8,400 feet deep, scattered with the remains of America's most advanced nuclear submarine, twisted into 5 major chunks of unrecognizable metal. This isn't just a crash site. It's an underwater monument to the violence of implosion. When Robert Ballard first laid eyes on the USS Thresher wreckage in 1985, he described it as looking like the submarine had been put through a shredding machine. This from a guy who would later discover the Titanic, a guy who thought he'd seen everything the deep ocean could throw at him. But the Thresher was different. The Titanic sank because of an iceberg, a gradual flooding, a slow descent, recognizable pieces settling on the sea floor. The Thresher? The Thresher exploded inward in a fraction of a second, crushed by pressures that turned steel into confetti. Ballard's robotic cameras captured something that still gives Navy officials nightmares. The submarine's hull, designed to withstand the crushing depths of the ocean, had been compressed into fragments scattered across an area larger than 20 football fields. Let me paint you a picture of what Ballard found down there. The bow section, once the submarine's proud front end, was completely separated from the rest of the vessel and crushed into an almost unrecognizable mass of twisted steel. The distinctive sonar dome that housed the Thresher's acoustic detection equipment was cracked open like an eggshell. Its sophisticated electronics spilled across the sea floor, like the guts of some mechanical beast. The sail, that tower-like structure that houses the submarine's periscopes and communication equipment, was buried nose first in the silt, its hull number 593, still visible like a tombstone marking the grave of American naval ambition. The sight of those numbers, clear and readable after 2 decades underwater, sent chills through the research team. The engineering spaces, where the submarine's nuclear reactor and propulsion systems once hummed with life, were pulverized beyond recognition. Massive chunks of machinery, each weighing tons, were scattered like a child's broken toys. High-pressure air flasks, designed to help the submarine surface in emergencies, were crumpled like aluminum cans. The operations area, where sonar operators and navigation teams once worked, was a twisted maze of collapsed bulkheads and crushed equipment. The sophisticated computers and communication gear that made the Thresher one of the most advanced submarines ever built were reduced to unidentifiable fragments of metal and wire. And the stern section, housing the submarine's propulsion and steering equipment, was so mangled that investigators initially couldn't even identify what parts they were looking at. But here's what made the scene even more haunting. The debris field wasn't just randomly scattered. The pattern told a story of catastrophic violence that played out in seconds. Heavy equipment had been thrown forward by the implosion, creating dense clusters of machinery in the bow area. Lighter materials were spread in a fan pattern, carried by deep ocean currents over the decades since the disaster. Personal equipment, tools, gauges, small mechanical components, were scattered like confetti from hell across the entire site. And then there were the things that shouldn't have survived at all. Insulation material, designed to keep the submarine's interior comfortable, was found floating in the water column above the wreck. Cork fragments from interior paneling drifted like snow in the submarine's artificial atmosphere. Yellow plastic components, probably from electrical systems, stood out against the gray silt, like flowers in a graveyard. These materials shouldn't have escaped the submarine's hull. The fact that they were found scattered across the debris field suggested that the implosion was so violent, so sudden, that it literally turned the submarine inside out. But the most unsettling discovery wasn't the scale of the destruction. It was the complete absence of human remains. Not a single intact body was found in the wreckage. Not one. The implosion had been so violent, the compression so extreme, that every human being aboard the Thresher had been instantly vaporized by what scientists call adiabatic compression, the same process that makes a diesel engine work, where rapid compression generates heat hot enough to ignite fuel. The men aboard the Thresher didn't just die. They were literally incinerated by physics itself. But here's what kept bothering Ballard and his team. If the implosion was so instantaneous, so complete, so devastating that it vaporized 129 human beings and turned a nuclear submarine into scattered debris, how could anyone have survived long enough to make those acoustic signals? The math didn't add up. The physics didn't make sense. Either the acoustic signals were something else entirely, or the implosion wasn't as instantaneous as everyone thought. And that's when they started looking more closely at the debris itself. Because mixed in with all that twisted steel and pulverized equipment, investigators found clues that the crew might have known exactly what was happening to them. Personal equipment was scattered in patterns that suggested deliberate action, not random destruction. Tools were found in areas where they shouldn't have been if the submarine had simply flooded and imploded. Emergency equipment showed signs of hasty use, as if crew members had been desperately trying to save their boat right up until the end. The wreckage told a story of men fighting for their lives, not dying peacefully in their sleep. But the debris field held more secrets than just the evidence of destruction, because floating among the wreckage, decades after the disaster, were personal items that told a story no one was prepared to hear. When search teams combed the surface debris in 1963, they found rubber gloves, the kind nuclear submarine crews used for handling radioactive materials, still floating after 3 days underwater. Think about that for a moment. 3 days in the North Atlantic, in April, in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes, and these gloves were still afloat. Someone had been wearing them. Someone had been doing their job, handling nuclear materials, going through the routine procedures that kept a nuclear submarine running, right up until the moment everything went to hell. But those gloves were just the beginning of what searchers found floating on the surface. Along with the gloves came insulation fragments, bits of the material that lined the submarine's interior walls to keep the crew compartments comfortable. Cork pieces from internal paneling bobbed on the waves like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that would never be put back together. Yellow plastic fragments, probably from electrical components, drifted in the current like artificial flowers scattered on a watery grave. Each piece was a silent witness to 129 interrupted lives. These weren't just random debris from a sunken submarine. They were the last traces of men who had woken up that morning thinking they were going on a routine test dive. The rubber gloves were particularly haunting because they told such a specific story. Nuclear submarines require constant maintenance of their radioactive systems. Crew members have to handle fuel rods, clean reactor compartments, perform tests on contaminated equipment. It's dangerous work that requires specialized protective gear. Those gloves meant that someone, probably multiple someones, had been working in the reactor compartment when the disaster began. They'd been following safety protocols, protecting themselves from radiation exposure, doing the unglamorous but essential work that kept the submarine's nuclear heart beating. And then, in a matter of minutes, those careful safety procedures became irrelevant. The gloves that were meant to protect from radiation became artifacts of a much more immediate and deadly threat. But the surface debris revealed something else troubling. The patterns didn't match what you'd expect from a simple implosion. If the Thresher had flooded rapidly and imploded at crush depth, as the official story claimed, most of the debris would have stayed with the wreckage. Heavy items would sink immediately. Light materials might float, but they'd be scattered randomly by currents and waves. Instead, searchers found organized patterns of debris. Materials from the same compartments clustered together. Equipment that should have been separated by watertight bulkheads was mixed together. It looked more like an explosion than an implosion. The cork fragments were especially telling. Cork is used in submarines for its buoyancy and insulation properties, but it's installed in ways that make it very difficult to remove. Finding cork pieces floating on the surface suggested that the submarine's interior had been subjected to forces violent enough to rip built-in components from their mountings. Yellow plastic fragments posed another puzzle. These materials are typically used in electrical systems deep inside the submarine, protected by multiple layers of hull and bulkheads. Finding them on the surface meant that the disaster had somehow turned the submarine inside out, forcing internal components through the hull and into the water. The most heartbreaking artifacts were the personal ones. Not the big, dramatic pieces that made headlines, but the small, intimate objects that told stories of individual lives. Pieces of clothing were found, torn and waterlogged but still recognizable. A fragment of a coffee cup, the kind used in the submarine's mess hall. Small metal objects that might have been personal tools or keepsakes. Each item represented someone's life, someone's routine, someone's last moments before the ocean claimed them. But no personal effects like wallets, rings, or photographs survived. The violence of the implosion had destroyed anything that couldn't float, anything that wasn't tough enough to withstand the crushing forces that destroyed the submarine. The gloves, though, the gloves were different. They were made of heavy rubber designed to withstand chemical exposure and radiation. They were built to last, built to protect, and in the end, they outlasted the men who wore them. Imagine the last person to wear those gloves. Maybe he was a young sailor, fresh out of nuclear training, performing his first maintenance rotation in the reactor compartment. Maybe he was a seasoned chief, someone who'd been working on nuclear submarines since they were first invented. Maybe he was thinking about his family, about shore leave, about what he'd do when this test dive was over. We'll never know his name. We'll never know his story. But his gloves survived to tell us that he was there, that he was doing his job, that he was protecting himself from radiation exposure even as a much more immediate and deadly threat was developing around him. The recovery teams cataloged every piece of debris they found, photographed it, analyzed it, tried to use it to understand what had happened to the Thresher. But they weren't just collecting evidence. They were gathering the scattered pieces of 129 human stories. Each fragment of insulation represented someone's bunk, someone's private space in the cramped confines of a nuclear submarine. Every piece of yellow plastic was part of the electrical systems that someone had maintained, someone had relied on, someone had trusted with their life. And those rubber gloves? They represented the last moments of someone's working life, the final time someone put on protective equipment and went about the dangerous but necessary business of keeping a nuclear submarine operational. But the most chilling artifact wasn't something personal. It was a single piece of evidence that proved the Navy had been lying about what really happened down there. 1 foot-long piece of mangled pipe that would rewrite the entire story. In all that scattered debris, investigators found exactly 1 foot of mangled pipe from the submarine's saltwater system. And it told a story of criminal negligence that the Navy tried to cover up for decades. This wasn't just any piece of pipe. This was evidence. Physical, undeniable proof that the deadliest submarine disaster in American history was completely preventable. The pipe fragment came from what's called a brazed joint, a cheap welding technique where 2 pieces of metal are connected using a brass alloy that melts at a lower temperature than the metals being joined. Think of it as industrial-strength soldering. It's fast, it's easy, and it's cheap. It's also completely inappropriate for high-pressure submarine systems. See, when you're 1,300 feet underwater, every square inch of your submarine hull is being pressed on by about 580 pounds of water pressure. That's like having a pickup truck sitting on every square inch of your boat. The systems that keep seawater out of your submarine need to be absolutely perfect, because even a small leak becomes a catastrophic failure under that kind of pressure. Engineers had been warning against using brazed joints in submarine saltwater systems since the 1940s. The technique was fine for surface ships, where water pressure was manageable and leaks could be repaired. But on submarines, especially nuclear submarines that operated at depths where a leak meant instant death, brazed joints were a disaster waiting to happen. The Navy knew this. Engineering reports from the 1950s specifically called out brazed joints as a weak point in submarine design. Recommendations were made to use welded joints, which were stronger but more expensive and time-consuming to install. But in the early 1960s, the Navy was in a hurry. The Cold War was heating up. Soviet submarines were getting more advanced, and the nuclear submarine program was under pressure to produce boats faster and cheaper than ever before. So they cut corners. They used brazed joints in the Thresher's saltwater systems because it saved time and money. They ignored their own engineers' warnings because meeting deadlines was more important than following safety protocols. That 1 foot of mangled pipe proved it. The pipe fragment showed clear evidence of brazed joint failure. The brass alloy had separated from the steel piping under pressure, exactly as engineers had predicted it would. Metallurgical analysis revealed that the joint had been improperly installed, with insufficient brass penetration and poor surface preparation. In other words, not only had the Navy used a dangerous welding technique, they'd used it badly. But here's where the story gets really infuriating. Declassified documents from the Thresher's final overhaul reveal that shipyard workers had identified problems with the submarine's saltwater piping systems. They'd found evidence of poor welding, inadequate joint strength, and potential failure points. Their concerns were documented, filed in reports, brought to the attention of Navy officials, and ignored. The Thresher was behind schedule. The overhaul was over budget. Navy brass wanted the submarine back in service as quickly as possible. So when shipyard workers raised concerns about piping systems, They were told to fix what they could and launch on schedule. Critical safety work was deferred. Inspections were rushed. Quality control was sacrificed for speed. The result? A nuclear submarine went to sea with piping systems that were ticking time bombs. When that brazed joint finally failed at 1,300 feet below the surface, it started a cascade of disasters that doomed the Thresher. Seawater sprayed into the engine room, shorting out electrical systems. The reactor automatically shut down when it detected water in areas where water shouldn't be. Without reactor power, the submarine lost propulsion. Commander John Wesley Harvey, the Thresher's captain, immediately ordered emergency procedures. Blow the ballast tanks. Surface immediately. Get the boat out of danger. But the emergency systems had their own problems. The high-pressure air used to blow ballast tanks was stored at temperatures well below the ocean temperature. When that cold air hit the warmer seawater in the ballast tank lines, it formed ice. The ice blocked the air lines, preventing the ballast tanks from blowing properly. So instead of surfacing rapidly, the Thresher continued to sink. Powerless, unable to blow ballast, the submarine descended toward its crushed depth, while the crew fought desperately to save their boat. That 1 foot of pipe caused all of it. A $45 million submarine, 129 human lives, years of nuclear submarine development, all lost because someone decided to save a few dollars and a few hours of installation time. But the pipe fragment revealed something else, something that made the acoustic signals even more mysterious. The failure pattern suggested that the initial flooding wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't the kind of massive rupture that would instantly doom the submarine. It was a significant leak, serious enough to cause electrical problems and reactor shutdown, but not necessarily fatal by itself. The Thresher should have been able to surface, even with the saltwater leak. The emergency ballast blow should have worked, even with some ice formation in the lines. The crew should have had time to respond, to fight for their boat, to save their lives. The fact that they didn't succeed doesn't mean they didn't try. And that brings us back to those mysterious acoustic signals. Because new evidence suggests some of the crew survived the initial failure and knew exactly what was coming. Here's the nightmare scenario that keeps submarine experts awake at night. Acoustic analysis suggests the USS Thresher didn't flood instantly like the Navy claimed, but experienced electrical failures that left the crew conscious and aware during their descent to crushed depth. Let me walk you through what probably happened in those final minutes aboard the Thresher, based on declassified acoustic data and new analysis of the disaster timeline. At 9:09 a.m. on April 10, 1963, the brazed joint failure we talked about earlier caused seawater to spray into the submarine's engine room. But this wasn't a catastrophic flood. It was a significant leak that caused electrical shorts and forced an emergency reactor shutdown. The submarine still had ballast tanks. It still had compressed air systems. It still had emergency procedures that should have brought it safely to the surface. Commander Harvey immediately ordered those procedures, and his crew began executing them. But then the problems started compounding. The reactor shutdown meant no main propulsion. The electrical shorts meant some control systems weren't responding properly. The emergency ballast blow was partially successful. Some tanks vented, others didn't, because ice was forming in the air lines. Instead of surfacing rapidly, the Thresher began sinking slowly, its crew fighting desperately to regain buoyancy and control. At 9:13 a.m., Harvey transmitted his famous last message: "Experiencing minor difficulty, have positive up angle, attempting to blow." Notice what he said: positive up angle. The submarine was pointed upward. The crew was trying to surface. They weren't giving up, but they were losing the battle. Over the next several minutes, the Thresher continued descending. The crew would have been working frantically, trying to restart the reactor, attempting to clear ice from ballast tank lines, pumping water from flooded compartments, doing everything humanly possible to save their boat. And they would have been acutely aware that they were running out of time. See, every submarine crew knows their boat's crush depth, the maximum depth the hull can withstand before catastrophic failure. For the Thresher-class submarines, that depth was somewhere around 2,400 feet. As they passed 1,500 feet, then 1,800 feet, then 2,000 feet, the crew would have known they were approaching the point of no return. The hull would have been groaning under the pressure. Rivets and welds would have been straining. Inside the submarine, the men would have heard the sounds of their boat being slowly compressed by the ocean above them. At 9:17 a.m., the Thresher transmitted a partial, garbled message, exceeding test depth. Then silence. But according to acoustic data, the submarine didn't implode immediately. SOSUS stations detected the sounds of electrical systems sparking and failing. They heard what sounded like emergency procedures being attempted, pumps running, air systems operating, mechanical equipment being operated under stress. For several more minutes, the Thresher was still fighting. The final implosion came at approximately 9:18 a.m., when the submarine finally reached its crush depth and the hull collapsed catastrophically. The sound was picked up by acoustic monitoring stations hundreds of miles away. A sharp, violent crack as the ocean crushed 3,170 tons of steel and everything inside it. But that's not the end of the acoustic story. For the next 24 hours, SOSUS stations continued detecting metallic impacts from the debris site. 37 separate instances of organized rhythmic banging. Some lasted several minutes. Others came in short, urgent bursts. The official explanation: collapsing debris, metal settling on the seafloor, natural acoustic phenomena. But submarine experts who've studied the data aren't convinced. The sounds were too organized, too rhythmic, too much like the emergency signaling procedures that submarine crews are trained to use when their main communication systems fail. Here's one possibility that keeps coming up in unofficial discussions among submarine veterans. What if some sections of the Thresher remained intact after the initial implosion? Modern computer modeling of submarine implosions suggests that it's possible for compartments to survive the crush depth failure, especially if they're sealed and protected by other structures. A trapped crew compartment could theoretically maintain life support for hours, even after the main hull failed. If that happened, if some crew members survived the implosion in sealed compartments, those acoustic signals might represent their desperate attempts to signal rescue ships above. Think about it. You're trapped in a small compartment, 8,400 feet underwater, knowing that your submarine has been destroyed, but that you're somehow still alive. You have limited air, no communication systems, no way to reach the surface. What do? You bang on the hull. You use whatever tools you have to make noise, hoping that someone above will hear you. You follow emergency procedures, tapping out coded signals that other submariners will recognize. You do everything you can to let the world know you're still alive. The USS Seawolf, participating in the search effort, reported picking up what sounded like response signals. When they sent sonar pings toward the debris site, they sometimes received metallic impacts in return, as if someone was banging back. But the water was too deep for rescue. The technology didn't exist to reach survivors at 8,400 feet. Even if the Navy had admitted that crew members were still alive, there was nothing they could do to save them. So instead, they chose to stick with the story of instant death. No survivors, no one left behind, no agonizing questions about men dying slowly in the depths while rescue ships circled helplessly above. The alternative, admitting that American sailors had survived the initial disaster and then died slowly, alone, in the darkness, was too horrible to acknowledge publicly. But those 37 acoustic signals suggest that's exactly what happened. Some experts believe the signals represent crew members using tools to bang on the hull, trying to attract attention from rescue ships. Others think they might have been attempting to send coded messages using emergency protocols. The most heartbreaking theory is that trapped submariners were following their training to the very end, tapping out distress signals that no one was equipped to receive. The signals weren't random. They came in patterns. Groups of impacts followed by silence, then more groups. If you know maritime distress codes, some of those patterns are eerily familiar, and they continued for almost a full day after the implosion. 16 hours of organized, deliberate banging from men who knew they were going to die but refused to give up hope. The last signal was detected at 8:47 a.m. on April 11th, almost exactly 24 hours after the disaster began. Then silence. Final silence. Were those signals really from trapped crew members? Or were they just the random sounds of twisted metal settling on the ocean floor? The Navy classified the acoustic data for 60 years rather than answer that question. And even now, with the documents finally released, they refuse to speculate about what those signals might have represented. But one thing is certain: the clean, simple story of instant death and immediate tragedy that the Navy told the world in 1963 was not the whole truth. The real story of the USS Thresher disaster is messier, more complicated, and infinitely more heartbreaking than anyone wanted to admit. Those 129 men didn't just die in a submarine accident. They died fighting for their lives, following their training, trying everything they could to save themselves and their boat. Some of them might have survived for hours in the depths, tapping out desperate signals that no one was equipped to answer. The ocean floor remembers their struggle. The acoustic data preserves their final attempts to communicate with the world above. And their story deserves to be told, not the sanitized version that spared the Navy uncomfortable questions, but the real story of human courage and desperation in the face of impossible odds. Even after 60 years, the ocean hasn't finished revealing its secrets about the Thresher. But one thing is clear: those men went down fighting, and they deserve to be remembered for the heroes they were, not just as victims of a preventable tragedy. The acoustic signals from the USS Thresher remind us that even in the depths of disaster, even facing certain death, human beings will continue to hope, continue to fight, continue to reach out to each other across the darkness. Those 37 metallic impacts weren't just sounds. They were voices from the deep, crying out to be remembered. What do you think those knocking sounds really meant? Share your theories in the comments below.